Sylvester Stallone walked into a regular gym, but one trainer thought he could make fun of him. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're from. The gym was alive with its usual rhythm, a controlled chaos of determination and sweat. A massive facility in the heart of Los Angeles, it attracted people from all walks of life. Business executives seeking to relieve stress, aspiring bodybuilders pushing their limits, and casual gym-goers trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle. Rows of gleaming treadmills hummed with the rhythmic pounding of feet, weight machines clanked under the strain of heavy plates, and the unmistakable scent of rubber mats, metal, and faint traces of sweat filled the air. Bright LED lights reflected off mirrored walls, making the room seem even larger than it was. Among the regulars was Vince Carver, one of the gym's most well-known personal trainers. Tall, muscular, and always impeccably dressed in the latest high-end athletic wear, Vince had built a reputation for being both an expert and an entertainer. His booming voice carried across the gym, offering unsolicited advice, playful jabs, and, at times, outright mockery of those he deemed unworthy of serious training. He thrived on the admiration of his clients, relishing the way they gathered around him like disciples hanging on to every word. He wasn't cruel, at least not in a direct way, but he had a habit of making people feel small without them even realizing it. It was all part of his persona. He was the alpha, the king of this gym, the man who knew more, lifted more, and commanded more respect than anyone else. Or so he believed. That afternoon, Vince was in his element, surrounded by a small group of regulars near the free weight section. He had just finished a set of heavy bench presses, pausing to flex his arms subtly as he sat up. The laughter of his clients filled the air as he cracked a joke about someone in the background using too light of a weight. Then, just as he was preparing to move on to another set, the gym doors opened and someone unexpected walked in. He wasn't flashy, didn't draw attention to himself. He wasn't wearing the latest fitness gear, no expensive headphones or branded gym bag, just a plain gray hoodie, black sweatpants, and a simple duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had been in gyms his entire life, but there was no arrogance in his posture, just a sense of purpose, as if he had come to do exactly what he needed to do, no more, no less. Most people didn't notice him at first. Why would they? He didn't make an entrance, didn't demand attention, but Vince noticed. Something about the man's presence bothered him, though he couldn't quite place why. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, that unspoken self-assurance. Maybe it was because he wasn't fawning over Vince like so many others did. For a moment, Vince studied the newcomer as he set his bag down and began a simple warm-up. Nothing flashy, just slow, controlled stretches. The kind of warm-up that seasoned athletes did, not the kind that newcomers attempted with exaggerated effort to prove they belonged. And then, like a slow puzzle coming together in Vince's mind, recognition sparked. It was Sylvester Stallone. Not just an actor, not just a Hollywood star, but an icon, a legend. A man whose very name was synonymous with strength, endurance, and sheer willpower. Vince blinked, then glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed. Strangely, no one seemed to react. Maybe it was the casual outfit, the lack of spectacle. Maybe people weren't expecting a celebrity to walk in so unassumingly, so they weren't looking for him. The realization made something stir inside Vince, something that had been a part of him for as long as he could remember. Competition. The need to prove himself. The gym was his domain. Here, he was the one people admired, the one people respected. And if Stallone had come in thinking he could just blend in, Vince wasn't about to let that happen. A slow grin spread across his face. He could have let it go. He could have respected the fact that a man like Stallone had chosen to work out in this gym, that maybe he just wanted a quiet session. But that wasn't Vince's style. No, this was an opportunity, a chance to show everyone who really ran this place. So, as Stallone finished his warm-up and moved toward the weight racks, Vince took a few steps forward, making sure his voice was just loud enough to be heard by those around him. "Hey, old man," he called out, grinning as he leaned casually against a nearby machine. "You sure you're in the right place? Retirement home is down the street." A few chuckles echoed through the gym. Not outright laughter, but enough to feed Vince's ego. He expected a reaction, maybe a scowl, maybe a defensive retort, but Stallone barely glanced at him. He simply continued his movements, shifting into another stretch completely unfazed. Vince wasn't used to being ignored. That only made him more determined. "You lost or something?" he continued, stepping closer. "Because this ain't a movie set, and I don't see any stunt doubles around to lift for you." More laughter, this time a bit louder. People were starting to pay attention. Still, Stallone didn't react. He simply finished his stretch, rolled his shoulders, and reached for a set of dumbbells. Vince clenched his jaw. This guy was really going to act like he didn't hear him? Like he didn't matter? Fine. If words wouldn't get a rise out of him, maybe action would. Vince straightened up, cracking his knuckles before grabbing a set of dumbbells himself. He made sure they were heavier than what Stallone had picked, then purposefully stepped into his line of sight, making a show of curling the weights with exaggerated effort. "Hope you're not here for a light workout," he said, his voice dripping with smugness. "Because in this gym, we don't do easy." He expected a challenge, a bit of fire in the old man's eyes, but instead, Stallone just gave him a small, knowing smile. Not condescending, not defensive, just a smile. And somehow that irritated Vince more than anything else, because that smile wasn't one of arrogance or defiance. It wasn't even a dismissal. It was something much worse. It was a look of a man who had nothing to prove. A look that said, "I've already done it all. I don't need to show you anything." And yet, Vince wasn't ready to back down, because this was his gym, his territory. And if Stallone thought he could just walk in and ignore him, he was about to learn a lesson. One Vince was determined to teach. Vince didn't like being ignored. It gnawed at him like an itch just beneath the skin that he couldn't scratch. He was used to people reacting to him, laughing at his jokes, trying to match his energy, either stepping up to the challenge or backing down with a sheepish grin. But this guy, this old man in the gray hoodie, wasn't doing either. Stallone hadn't said a word, hadn't so much as acknowledged the taunts. That should have been enough for Vince to let it go, to move on, but instead it only fueled his irritation. It wasn't the kind of dismissal that came from arrogance or indifference. It was worse. It was the kind of silence that came from someone who knew exactly who he was and had nothing to prove. Vince couldn't stand that. He took another step closer, making sure his presence was impossible to ignore. He flexed his arms slightly, adjusting the sleeves of his compression shirt, exaggerating his movements just enough to send a message. He wasn't just some random trainer. He was the guy who owned this gym, not in a legal sense, but in the way that mattered. This was his domain, and he wasn't about to let some washed-up action star walk in like he belonged here more than Vince did. "You sure you're in the right place, buddy?" Vince said, his voice carrying across the gym, ensuring that a few more heads turned their way. "This ain't a film set. We lift real weights here." The group of regulars nearby chuckled, feeding off Vince's confidence, waiting for Stallone to take the bait. But he didn't. Instead, Stallone continued his warm-up, rolling his shoulders, shifting his stance, preparing his body with slow, deliberate movements, the kind that spoke of years, decades of training. That only annoyed Vince more. He scoffed, shaking his head. "All right, I get it. You're trying to stay in character or something? Playing a strong, silent type? That might work in a movie, but in here, silence won't lift those weights for you." Still nothing. Vince clenched his jaw, feeling his usual confidence starting to waver just slightly. He wasn't used to this. People always responded. They either laughed and joined in on the joke or got defensive and tried to prove him wrong. Either way, it gave him something to work with. But this wasn't what he was used to. And then, finally, Stallone moved. Not toward Vince, not toward confrontation, just toward the weight rack. He reached for a set of dumbbells, gripping them with a casual ease, testing their weight in his hands before positioning himself for a set of curls. His grip was firm, his elbows tucked in, his form controlled and precise. Not an ounce of wasted movement. It was the kind of form that only came from experience. Vince watched, something stirring in the back of his mind. He had been in this game long enough to know the difference between someone who worked out casually and someone who lived it. And, whether he wanted to admit it or not, Stallone was the latter. But admitting that meant backing down, and Vince never backed down. He grabbed a heavier pair of dumbbells, stepping just a little too close, making sure Stallone saw the weights in his hands. He exaggerated the motion as he lifted, adding an unnecessary grunt with each curl, making a show of his strength. "You sure that's enough for you?" Vince asked, his tone dripping with smugness. "Don't want to start with something too light, do you?" Finally, Stallone glanced at him. It was brief, just a flicker of a look, but it was there. And in that moment, Vince felt something unexpected. Not anger, not frustration, something else. A feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Doubt. Because that look wasn't the look of someone intimidated. It wasn't the look of someone about to back down or make excuses. It wasn't even the look of someone annoyed by the taunts. It was the look of someone who had been here before. Who had dealt with 1,000 guys just like Vince. Who had already won battles like this before they even began. Vince hesitated, but only for a second. Then he forced out a chuckle, shaking off whatever strange feeling had just crawled into his chest. All right, he said, rolling his shoulders. Maybe dumbbells aren't your thing. Let's see what else you got." He gestured toward the bench press station, where a loaded barbell sat, waiting for its next challenger. "How about we put some real weight on the bar?" Vince said. "Unless, of course, you're more of a cardio guy." Another chuckle rippled through the onlookers. Stallone didn't answer. He simply set his dumbbells down, took a slow breath, and walked toward the bench press. Vince followed, his smirk widening. Finally, he had him where he wanted. Or so he thought. Because what happened next would be something that no one in the gym would forget. Not today. Not ever. Vince led the way to the bench press station, the smirk still fixed on his face as he weaved through the clusters of gym-goers. He could feel eyes following them now, interest in the unfolding spectacle growing. It was subtle, the way people adjusted their routines, slowing down on the treadmills, pausing mid-set, or casually stepping closer to get a better view. The air had changed, the usual hum of iron and music replaced with the quiet anticipation of something about to happen. He liked that feeling, the attention, the energy. This was his stage, his arena, and right now he was about to put on a show. Stallone followed in silence, his pace unhurried. He carried himself with a deliberate calm, neither rushed nor hesitant. There was no performance in his movements, no theatrics, just a quiet certainty. That in itself irritated Vince. He had expected some kind of reaction by now, annoyance, amusement, maybe even frustration. But there was nothing. It was like trying to get a rise out of a stone wall. When they reached the bench press station, Vince patted the barbell, the plates rattling slightly at the impact. 225 pounds were already loaded, enough to be respectable, but not intimidating. A good starting point. He glanced at Stallone, gauging his reaction. "You ever lift anything heavier than a movie script?" Vince asked, his voice loud enough for the surrounding gym-goers to hear. A few chuckles broke out. Stallone merely looked at the bar, then back at Vince, expression unreadable. "Cool, cool," Vince continued, undeterred by the lack of response. "Tell you what, since I know you Hollywood types love stunt doubles, I'll go first. That way you can see how it's done." Without waiting for an answer, he slid onto the bench, gripping the bar with well-practiced confidence. He had done this hundreds, thousands of times before. This was his domain, his strength. With a deep breath, he unracked the bar and smoothly lowered it to his chest, then drove it upward with practiced ease. 1 rep, 2, 3. He made sure his form was solid, his movements controlled but effortless. By the time he hit 10 reps, his arms were burning, but he wasn't about to show it. He pushed out 2 more, then racked the bar with a satisfied exhale. Sitting up, he rolled his shoulders, flexed his chest just enough to emphasize the pump, and turned to Stallone. "Your turn," he said, motioning toward the bench. For a moment, Stallone didn't move. He just stood there, eyes on the bar, as if weighing something far more than just the metal plates. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. Vince leaned back, arms crossed over his chest, waiting. This was the moment. This was when the old man would either struggle or back down. Either way, Vince would come out on top, but Stallone didn't struggle, and he didn't back down. He simply lay back on the bench, positioned his hands on the bar, and lifted. The moment the weight came off the rack, Vince felt something shift in the air. There was no hesitation in Stallone's movement, no waver in his grip. The bar came down smoothly, controlled as if it weighed nothing, and then, with effortless power, it went back up. 1, 2, 3. The surrounding gym-goers who had been watching casually now straightened, attention sharpening. 4, 5, 6. Vince's smirk faltered. 7, 8, 9. By the time Stallone reached 12 reps, he didn't even look like he was exerting himself. His breathing was steady, his form impeccable, and when he finally racked the bar, he sat up without fanfare, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off nothing more than a mild stretch. The murmurs started immediately. A few whispered conversations, a couple of impressed nods. It wasn't just that he had done the reps. It was how he had done them, effortlessly, casually. Vince's jaw tightened. "Not bad," he said, forcing out a chuckle, trying to keep his tone light. "Guess those old man muscles still got some juice." Stallone didn't react. He just stood, stretching his arms slightly before giving Vince a small, almost knowing nod. And that was what irritated Vince the most. That nod. It wasn't one of arrogance. It wasn't a taunt. It was just acknowledgement. As if this whole thing hadn't been a competition at all. As if Vince wasn't even a factor in whatever Stallone had just done. Vince clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. He wasn't about to let this go. Not yet. All right, he said, waving a hand as if brushing it off. That was just the warm-up. Let's see how you handle some real weight. He motioned to the weight plates stacked nearby, the challenge clear. If Stallone thought he could keep up, he'd have to prove it. For the first time since walking into the gym, Stallone actually responded. He met Vince's gaze, his expression unreadable, then stepped forward. Without a word, he reached for the plates and started adding weight. Vince's smirk vanished completely. One plate, then another, then another. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the gym as Stallone calmly loaded the bar, his movements unhurried, measured. When he finally stopped, the weight was well beyond what Vince had lifted. Vince swallowed, aware that every eye in the gym was now locked onto them. There was no turning back now. He forced out a grin. "All right, Hollywood," he said, masking his unease with bravado. "Let's see if you can actually lift that." But deep down, for the first time, Vince wasn't so sure he wanted to see the answer. The gym had never been this quiet. It wasn't a silence of inactivity. Weights still clanked, treadmill belts still hummed under the pounding of sneakers, and the air still carried the rhythmic sound of exhalations and grunts. But the usual background noise had been swallowed by something else, something heavier than any barbell in the building. It was anticipation. Every eye in the room was on the two men standing by the bench press station. The energy had shifted, turning the once casual scene into something else entirely. Vince had lost the ease in his posture, though he hid it well. His smirk remained, but there was a stiffness to it now, a subtle tension in his jaw that betrayed the uncertainty creeping in. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Stallone was supposed to crack, supposed to show weakness, supposed to be just another aging celebrity past his prime. Instead, he had effortlessly outmatched Vince's warm-up weight, and now he was pushing things further, adding plates to the bar as if he were adjusting the difficulty on a casual workout session. The added weight wasn't something Vince could dismiss. It was heavy. Heavy enough that even some of the stronger lifters in the gym would hesitate before attempting it. This was the kind of weight that separated casual gym-goers from true-strength athletes, and Stallone had stacked it on as though it were nothing more than an afterthought. Vince let out a small chuckle, forcing himself to sound amused rather than unnerved. "All right, big guy," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's see if you can actually lift that. I mean, I know movie magic can make anyone look strong, but this is the real deal." Stallone didn't respond. He simply positioned himself on the bench with the same quiet precision he had displayed earlier. His hands found their grip on the bar, his feet planted firmly on the ground. There was no hesitation, no dramatic pause, no theatrics. He took a controlled breath and lifted. The plates rose smoothly, the bar steady in his grip. Not a single muscle in his body trembled as he lowered the weight, paused at the bottom, and then pressed it back up with the kind of control that came from years of disciplined training. 1 rep, 2, 3. The whispers in the gym turned into stunned murmurs. This wasn't just impressive. It was ridiculous. At his age, Stallone shouldn't have been able to do this. And yet, he was doing it, effortlessly, with perfect form, without a single sign of strain. Vince felt his throat tighten. This was supposed to be the moment where Stallone hit his limit, where he struggled, where Vince could step in and take back control of the situation. But instead, the older man was making it look easy. After hitting his final rep, Stallone racked the bar, sat up, and exhaled slowly. His face showed no exhaustion, no struggle. If anything, he looked like he was just getting started. A smattering of applause broke out among some of the gym-goers, not loud, but noticeable, respectful. That was the part that stung Vince the most. It wasn't just that Stallone had lifted more. It was that he had done it with complete composure. He hadn't tried to show off. He hadn't bragged. He had simply done what needed to be done and let the results speak for themselves. Vince couldn't let this stand. He could already feel the shift in energy around him, the way people were starting to look at him differently. He needed to do something fast. "Not bad," he said, forcing a grin as he rolled his shoulders. "But hey, anyone can be strong for a couple of seconds, right? Real fitness is about speed, power, and endurance. How about we see what you got in those departments?" Stallone finally met his gaze. There was no hostility there, no anger, just patience. It was infuriating. Vince jerked his chin toward the far side of the gym where a heavy punching bag hung from a reinforced steel frame. "Let's see if those hands of yours are as strong as they look," he said. "Unless, of course, you left all your fight scenes to the stunt guys." That finally earned a reaction. A small twitch at the corner of Stallone's mouth, something that could have been amusement but just as easily could have been something else. Without a word, he stood, adjusted his hoodie slightly, and walked toward the punching bag. The crowd followed. By the time they reached the designated area, the gym had effectively split into two groups, those still pretending to focus on their workouts, and those who had fully committed to watching this unfold. The latter group had grown significantly. Vince took position next to the bag, rolling his shoulders as he squared up to it. "Now," he said, making sure everyone could hear him, "it's not just about throwing punches, it's about precision, power, speed. You gotta hit hard, but you gotta hit smart." With a dramatic breath, he bounced on his feet a little, then threw a rapid series of punches into the bag. The strikes were sharp, loud, crisp. He finished with a heavy right hook that sent the bag swinging slightly, then turned back to Stallone with a smug grin. "Your turn." Stallone didn't immediately move. He simply stepped up to the bag, placed his hands on it for a moment, feeling its weight, its resistance. Then, with a slow exhale, he shifted his stance. And then he punched. The impact was a sound, not just a movement. A deep, resounding thud that sent a vibration through the steel frame. The bag swung wildly, its chains rattling from the sheer force. A few people in the crowd gasped. Vince's smirk disappeared. Stallone didn't stop. He followed up with a second punch, then a third. Each strike landed with calculated precision, each one carrying enough power to send the bag lurching. Then, without warning, he shifted to an elbow strike, then a kick, fluid movements that showed this wasn't just strength. It was skill, technique. By the time he finished, the bag was swaying back and forth like a pendulum. The air around them felt different. Vince swallowed hard. This wasn't just about lifting weights anymore. This wasn't just about proving who was stronger. This man wasn't just another gym-goer. He was something else entirely. And Vince was beginning to realize he might have made a mistake. The air in the gym had thickened, not with heat or humidity, but with something more intangible. Something Vince wasn't used to feeling in his own territory. The energy had shifted. The crowd that had once laughed at his jokes, now watching in silence, their attention drawn elsewhere. To Stallone. To the man who had, without a word, dismantled every expectation they had of him. Vince's heart pounded against his ribcage, though he told himself it was just the adrenaline, the natural rush of competition. But deep down, something colder settled in his gut. He had started this. He had been the one to poke, to prod, to push for a reaction. And now he had it, but not in the way he had wanted. The punching bag still swayed slightly from the force of Stallone's last strike, the chains creaking in protest. Vince had never seen anything like that. Not here. Not in a gym where most guys focused on aesthetics, where power was measured in plates and reps, not in the raw, controlled violence of a well-placed blow. Stallone hadn't just hit that bag, he had made a statement. A quiet, undeniable declaration of capability. And the worst part, he still wasn't gloating. Vince clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. He refused to let it be over. All right, he said, rolling his shoulders as he forced a grin onto his face. You got some power, I'll give you that. But let's see how you hold up with some real endurance work. Strength's one thing. Stamina, that's a whole other game. He turned and motioned toward the squat rack. The bar was already loaded with a heavy set of plates, more than enough to be considered impressive. It was the kind of weight that would humble most lifters, even the ones who trained regularly. This was Vince's domain. This was where he could take back control of the situation. The crowd followed, murmuring among themselves as they gathered around the squat station. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just casual competition anymore. This had become something else, something that had everyone invested. Vince took his position, standing in front of the rack with practiced ease. He adjusted the weight just slightly, adding a few more plates for good measure. He had to make a point. He had to remind everyone who he was. He ducked under the bar, positioning it across his shoulders. His stance was strong, firm, every movement intentional. Taking a deep breath, he unracked the bar and stepped back, his legs flexing under the strain. The weight was heavy but manageable. He had done this before, many times. Slowly, he lowered himself into the squat, feeling the tension build in his muscles, the burn in his thighs as he pushed back up. One rep, then another, then another. He made it to 5 before the strain really set in, before the familiar tremor began to creep into his legs. But he didn't stop. Not when the crowd was watching, not when Stallone was watching. By the time he hit 10, sweat dripped down his forehead. His breathing was heavier now, each movement requiring more effort. He gritted his teeth and forced out 2 more reps before finally racking the bar, stepping back with a triumphant exhale. He flexed his hands, shaking out the tension in his arms before turning to Stallone. "Let's see what you got, old man," he said, keeping his tone light, playful. But there was something else beneath it now, something uncertain. Stallone didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his movements unhurried as he approached the bar. He didn't inspect the weight, didn't ask questions. He simply positioned himself beneath the bar, his body settling into the stance of a man who had done this for a lifetime. And then he lifted. The gym fell into silence once more as the bar came off the rack. He stepped back, the weight settling against his body, and then, without a moment's hesitation, he descended. It was smooth, controlled, effortless. 1, 2, 3. Vince's breath hitched as Stallone continued. He wasn't just matching the reps, he was doing them with precision, with strength, with the kind of ease that made it clear this wasn't his limit. By the time he reached 10, Vince felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. 11, 12. Stallone didn't slow. 13, 14. He didn't stop. 15, 16. Vince swallowed, his throat dry. 17, 18. Finally, Stallone racked the bar, stepping away from the squat rack as if he had just finished a warm-up set. His breathing was steady, his body showed no signs of struggle. The gym remained silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. Vince forced a chuckle, though it came out weaker than he intended. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. That's solid work." But no one was looking at him anymore. They were looking at Stallone. They were looking at the man who had just walked into this gym, into Vince's domain, and dismantled every illusion Vince had built about himself. And for the first time since this had started, Vince didn't know what to do next. The squat rack stood silent, the bar resting in its cradle, loaded with the weight that Stallone had just lifted with the kind of ease that made it seem almost routine. The gym had never been this quiet. Even those who had been pretending to focus on their workouts had stopped entirely, watching the scene unfold. The energy in the air was thick, the shift undeniable. Vince could feel it pressing against him, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the weight of the competition anymore. It wasn't even about pride or dominance. It was something else, something he hadn't expected. It was the weight of realization. For the first time, Vince wasn't sure he was the strongest man in the room. That thought clawed at the edges of his mind, unraveling something deep inside him. He had spent years building his reputation, creating an image of himself as the top dog, the one who couldn't be challenged. He had shaped his entire identity around being the best, lifting the heaviest weights, enduring the hardest workouts, pushing further than anyone else. But now, in a matter of minutes, all of that had been called into question. And the worst part? Stallone hadn't even tried to prove anything. That was what made it sting the most. There had been no bravado, no arrogance, no need to assert dominance. Every move Stallone had made had been controlled, calculated, and effortless. He hadn't been trying to humiliate Vince. He hadn't been trying to win. He had simply done what he always did: train, work, move. Vince could feel the way people were looking at him now, the way their gazes had shifted. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't waiting for him to make another joke, to turn the situation around with his usual bravado. They were watching, waiting, as if they had just witnessed something they hadn't expected. And then it happened. Someone in the crowd murmured something. It was quiet at first, barely audible over the hum of the gym, but it spread like a ripple through water. Wait a second. That's Stallone. It was like a switch had been flipped. The realization spread, people whispering, nodding, piecing it together. The name carried weight, far more than Vince had expected. And suddenly, everything made sense. The controlled power, the unshakable composure, the way he had moved, not like a bodybuilder or a casual athlete, but like a fighter, like someone who had spent a lifetime training for more than just aesthetics. Vince's stomach twisted. He had spent the last 30 minutes trying to one-up Sylvester Stallone. Not just an actor, not just a Hollywood star, but a man whose name was synonymous with strength, resilience, and discipline. A man who had trained harder than most people ever would, who had built a body not just for show, but for function. A legend. Vince swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. For years, he had mocked guys who tried too hard, who faked their strength, who walked into the gym acting like they knew what they were doing when they didn't. He had prided himself on being able to spot the real ones, the ones who had earned their strength through years of dedication. And yet, he had completely misjudged the one man who embodied everything he claimed to respect. The gym had fallen into a strange, almost reverent silence. No one quite knew what to say. They were all watching Vince, waiting to see how he would react, waiting to see if he would try to salvage his pride or if he would acknowledge the truth of the situation. Vince's mind raced, his ego battling against the inevitable conclusion. He could try to laugh it off, pretend it had all been in good fun. He could act like it didn't matter, like he hadn't just been completely outclassed. Or he could face it. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his muscles still burning from the effort of his last lift. He looked at Stallone, really looked at him. Not as a challenger, not as a competitor, but as something else entirely. A teacher. Vince exhaled. "Damn," he muttered, just loud enough for the people around him to hear. "I really messed that one up, huh?" A few chuckles broke the tension, but they weren't mocking this time. They were lighter, almost relieved. Stallone didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, he simply nodded. "Respect is earned," he said, his voice calm, steady, "and it starts with how you treat others." Vince felt those words settle over him like a weight heavier than any barbell he had ever lifted. He had spent years demanding respect, trying to prove that he was the strongest, the toughest. But he had never considered that real strength wasn't about proving anything. It was about knowing when you didn't have to. He exhaled again, a slow nod forming before he even realized he was doing it. He had lost. But maybe, for the first time in a long time, he had actually learned something. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, thicker than the sweat and iron that filled the gym. Vince stood there, his mind still racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. The realization of who he had been challenging, the way the energy in the room had shifted, the way people were looking at him now, it all swirled together, pressing down on him in a way that had nothing to do with the physical strain. He had built his entire reputation on being the strongest, the most capable, the one who dominated every challenge. And yet, in a matter of minutes, that foundation had cracked. Not because he had been defeated in some grand, dramatic way, not because Stallone had humiliated him or taunted him, but because he had been faced with something undeniable. True strength didn't need to be proven, and that was exactly why Vince had lost. He had spent so much time trying to be the loudest voice in the room, to demand respect through power, to assert his dominance in every interaction. But Stallone had done none of that. He had walked in, stayed quiet, and simply let his actions speak. No need for bravado, no need for spectacle. Just discipline, skill, and quiet confidence. And that, more than anything, had crushed Vince's pride. The silence stretched between them, the gym still caught in the lingering tension of the moment. Stallone didn't move, didn't break eye contact, but there was no challenge in his gaze. No arrogance, just a quiet patience, as if he had been in this exact situation 100 times before, as if he already knew what was going through Vince's mind. Vince took a slow breath, the burn of his last lift still settling in his muscles. He could feel the eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do next. Would he laugh it off? Would he try to make some joke, brush it aside like it didn't matter? Or would he actually acknowledge what had just happened? For a brief, fleeting moment, his ego screamed at him to find a way out of this, to salvage what little pride he had left. But something else, something deeper, kept that impulse in check. Respect is earned. The words lingered in his mind, weightier than anything he had lifted today. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he needed to learn that lesson for real. Vince exhaled, shaking his head slightly before stepping forward. The smirk, the bravado, the cocky persona, it was gone now, replaced by something else, something real. He extended a hand. "You got me," he said, his voice quieter than before, but steady. "I misjudged you. Badly." The words weren't easy to say, but they felt right. Stallone looked at the offered hand for a moment, then took it, his grip firm but not crushing. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in proving a point. Just a simple, mutual understanding. "Everyone starts somewhere," Stallone said. The words hit Vince harder than he expected. He had spent so much time acting like he had already arrived, like he had nothing left to learn, nothing left to prove. But now, standing in front of a man who had built his entire life on discipline and dedication, he realized how small that mindset really was. Maybe he had been looking at this all wrong. Maybe strength wasn't about being the best in the room. Maybe it was about never stopping the climb. The handshake ended, but the moment didn't. Vince glanced around, noticing the way people were still watching, waiting for what would happen next. He could already feel the shift in how they saw him, not as the invincible leader of the gym, but as someone who had just been humbled in front of everyone. And strangely, for the first time in his life, that didn't feel like a bad thing. He turned back to Stallone, rubbing the back of his neck with a half-sheepish chuckle. "So," he said, "you just passing through, or are we going to be seeing you here more often?" Stallone shrugged, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Just another workout." Vince nodded, letting the words sink in. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to strength than he had ever realized. The gym was returning to its usual rhythm. The clang of weights, the rhythmic pounding of feet against treadmills, the steady hum of conversation. Everything was slipping back into place as if nothing had happened. But Vince knew better. Something had shifted. Something he couldn't quite put into words yet, but he could feel it, like a weight in his chest. Not heavy in the way a barbell was, but in the way realization settled in when it had nowhere else to go. Stallone had already moved on, back to his workout, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a brief detour in his routine. There was no lingering satisfaction in his expression, no trace of pride in having bested Vince. That, more than anything, was what stuck with him. Vince had spent the better part of the last hour trying to prove something, to himself, to the gym, to the man who had walked in without fanfare and taken everything Vince had to throw at him. And in the end, Stallone had simply met each challenge with quiet, unwavering strength. Strength that didn't need an audience. That was the part Vince couldn't shake. He had built his entire persona on being the strongest guy in the room. He had lived for the attention, thrived on the admiration, the reputation. And yet, here was a man who had nothing left to prove, who could have walked in, announced who he was, demanded respect based on his legacy alone. But he hadn't. He had simply trained, worked, moved. Vince glanced around at the other gym-goers. The way they looked at him was different now, not mocking, not judgmental, just expectant. They had seen him dominate before, had watched him push others around, demand respect through force. But now they were waiting for something else. They wanted to see what he would do with this moment. For the first time, Vince wasn't sure what that was. He let out a slow breath, then stepped away from the squat rack, shaking out the tension in his arms. His body still hummed with exertion, but his mind was racing faster than his pulse. He had always thought strength was about winning, about proving yourself, about standing at the top and making sure everyone knew how hard you had worked to get there. But now, after everything that had just happened, that idea felt small, incomplete. Strength wasn't just about how much weight you could lift or how many people admired you. It was about discipline, composure, knowing when to push and when to step back. It was about respect. He turned, watching as Stallone moved through another set, focused, unshaken, untouched by the commotion he had left in his wake. The man wasn't concerned with the crowd, wasn't soaking in the attention. He was just here to work, like he always had been. Vince ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He had been so damn arrogant. Not just today, not just with Stallone, with everyone. He had built his entire career on being better, on standing above, on making sure that no one forgot who ruled this gym. But what had that ever really given him? Respect? Maybe. But was it the kind of respect that mattered? The kind that lasted? He thought about the younger guys who had looked up to him, who had mimicked his swagger, his confidence, his attitude. How many of them had he actually helped? How many had he lifted up instead of tearing down? The realization hit like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time trying to be the strongest man in the room that he had forgotten what real strength looked like. And today, he had been given a lesson he wouldn't forget. His gaze drifted back to Stallone. The man was finishing his set, calm, composed, as steady as he had been when he walked through the doors. There was no triumph in his expression, no indication that he had just made a point, because that had never been the goal. And for the first time in a long time, Vince felt something strange. Admiration. He had spent the whole day trying to prove himself against someone who had never been his opponent to begin with. Stallone had never been competing with him. He had just been existing, training, doing what he had always done. It had been Vince who had turned it into a challenge, and in the end, the only person who had needed to prove something was him. Vince let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. Maybe it was time to stop trying so hard to be the strongest man in the room. Maybe it was time to just be better. As Stallone finished his workout, gathering his things, Vince felt an unexpected urge to say something. Not an apology. He had already given that in the handshake. But something else. Acknowledgement. He took a step forward, hesitating for only a second before speaking. "Hey." Stallone turned, his expression unreadable, but patient. Vince shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "You coming back here again?" There was a pause, then a small, knowing smile. Maybe. And with that, Stallone turned and walked toward the exit, his steps as steady and unhurried as they had been when he entered. He didn't need the final word, didn't need to revel in the moment, because he had already said everything that needed to be said. The gym doors swung shut behind him. Vince stood there for a moment, watching the space Stallone had left behind, then slowly exhaled. Strength wasn't about proving yourself, it was about knowing you didn't have to, and maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to understand what that meant. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and stay tuned for the next one. And don't forget to share this video with friends.